I'm going to talk about noogenesis as a process and human and AI agents iterating toward collaborative intelligence. Starting with three premises, the first, in the words of Teilhard de Chardin, we shall gain nothing by shutting our eyes to the shadow of collective death that has appeared on our horizon. On the contrary, we must open them wider. But how are we to exorcise this shadow? We've heard the warnings of climate change, the warnings of massive marine sea life die-off, the risks of nuclear holocaust and the destruction of war, and the potential warning that 50% of AI researchers believe there's a 10% or greater chance that humans will go extinct from our inability to control AI. But there are two key words here: believe, because what we believe can create future reality, and control, because what we're witnessing now is this battle of the large versus the small, and the powerful interests that have proprietary large language models and technology, and versus the enormous distributed open source community that's rapidly iterating new experiments. They don't have the same level of resources or the large language models, but the fascinating for anyone who didn't read it back at the time, it's worth going to look up the Google May 4th leaked no-mote memo, because it's a very intelligent argument, and he's basically saying open source is eating our lunch. Google had fired all their open source team on January 20th. So, and then suddenly this comes out. So suggesting that there's a potential flip side, that generative AI could be democratizing by empowering open source indie networks. So we've heard the warnings, but maybe AI is a reflection of ourselves that can wake us up. And we need to go back and listen to the great advice of Pogo, who said more than 50 years ago, this is 1971, Walt Kelly cartoon, we have met the enemy and he is us. So my first two premises are rather negative, but I hope to turn this around with the third premise. The second premise is that the sphere of thought emerges through noogenesis via knowledge and connection. That growth is impeded by a trend toward concentration of wealth and control. But the third premise is that collaborative intelligence emerges in distributed ecosystems where each player has collaborative autonomy to co-evolve the noosphere. Key concept here is collaborative autonomy. Of course, that was a key principle of Teilhard de Chardin. And this is an analogy to a thriving ecosystem where all the organisms are doing their own thing, but such that they enable each other. So an early essay that I wrote on collaborative intelligence, published in Daedalus, the Journal of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and reviewed by Harvard biologist Ernst Mayr. And I was really gratified that he found validity in the connection I was drawing between evolutionary principles and this definition of the paradox of prediction. So the first quadrant is what we conventionally associate with scientific method, valuing accuracy, precision in both engineering and the hard sciences. But as we move to the second quadrant, where the opposite principle applies, in other words, tolerance ranges determine the range within which creativity can occur. And so, for example, a species with large variation within that species has more raw material to work with to evolve. And with large tolerance to temperature change, of course, is more adaptable in the face of climate change. But as we move to the third and fourth quadrants, we are moving from in the first and second domain, the experimenter or observer is passive. In other words, assumed to be sitting outside the box and having no impact on the experiment. But as we move to the third and fourth quadrants, the experimenter, observer, is active. And potentiality has a variety of examples. You can go back to the Delphic Oracle, when the oracle was known for its enigmatic prophecies. And so those who had asked the question would have to step out into a huddle and say, well, the oracle said this, what does this actually mean? And so their subjective interpretation was then defining what to do next. But more recently, those who engage in future forecasting specifically wanted a different term because they didn't want to be in that straitjacket of accurate prediction. And as we move to the fourth quadrant, we're acknowledging the brilliance of C.S. Peirce, who thought that induction and deduction were inadequate to characterize scientific method, and that we really needed a third term, which he called abduction, the idea that there could be this unpredicted inferential leap of creativity in evolution, science, innovation, and the arts. And so what we believe actually forms in the third and fourth quadrant, the future. And our subjective reporting, all of our many eyes on the world, and I mean this very broadly, I mean, social bacterium on the left and a tree on the right, however living things sense and respond to their environments. That same year, Kawasaki, Japan, had an international competition, looking for ideas for the smart city of the 21st century. So I thought, well, this is also a contrasting, wonderful way to show the power of collaborative intelligence through a number of magnets to attract different communities. And for example, the Children's Story Exchange or the Festival of Dreams to engage artists to start to visualize the future of the city. The World Collage Bulletin and Participatory Expo, which anticipated the public internet that we did not yet have. And at the center, the core intelligent integrating system, bringing it all together. I want to take a quick survey through the history of ideas that I see as relevant to this big concept of the noosphere. And actually, I could have gone back another 100 years to 1759 to Adam Smith's publication of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Not too well known, but in 1776, well timed to coincide with the American Revolution, he published Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith's own intention was that these two companion volumes should be read together, and that the theory of moral sentiments should inform how the Wealth of Nations was implemented. We picked up one half and forgot the other half. And I think we did something sort of similar. I'm working on a book on Darwinism and Darwin's ideas, and have spent a lot of time with his notebooks. Darwin, who had great reservations, sat on his evolutionary theory for 23 years, but when he finally did publish it, Herbert Spencer became Darwin's branding agent. And basically, this expression, Darwinism equals survival of the fittest, Herbert Spencer put that out as a big public message. And Herbert Spencer had his own agenda. He was an editor with The Economist and hobnobbed with Andrew Carnegie, for example, and actually was creating an interpretation of Darwinism that both Andrew Carnegie and David Rockefeller loved it. They actually wrote on evolution themselves and how capitalism was a perfect manifestation of survival of the fittest. 20 years later, Henry George was looking, and he combines these two words, progress and poverty, in his great bestseller, looking at the progress of the latter half of the 19th century, where both industrialism and capitalism were making great progress, but at the same time, poverty was increasing, and there was a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Lizzie Magie was 13 when Henry George published his best-selling book and committed her life to try to get Henry George's principles out there about the problems of wealth, being able to generate more wealth without productive contribution to society. So she created GAME. She secured 2 US patents in 1904 and 1924. She took her GAME to Parker Brothers, who said, nah, we're not interested. So she open sourced her GAME. She was a Quaker, and so her GAME was distributed through Quaker congregations in many cities, and they would host a gameplay where they'd have the general concept of Lizzie Maggie's game board, but they'd essentially bring out a blank oilcloth with oil crayons and draw the game board, including the properties of their town and the issues that they needed to work on in their city. And many of you may know the rest of the story. In 1935, Parker Brothers stole Lizzie Maggie's idea and turned it into the opposite of what she was trying to teach the problems of monopolies. And instead, monopoly in 1935 took over. But if you look at Lizzie Maggie's game board, which does look a lot like Parker Brothers' Monopoly game board, but it's fundamentally different. She is in the upper right-hand corner, a poor house. The lower right is Mother Earth. She's concerned with the problems of coal mines, oil fields, timberland, farmlands, right? 1923, Teilhard de Chardin. And to his great credit, he did not embrace Herbert Spencer's mechanistic, materialistic interpretation of Darwinism. And he suffered for that because capitalism was a big, powerful force, and that was the interpretation that the powerful wanted. But Teilhard de Chardin anticipated some big ideas that followed him. The idea of James Lovelock of the Gaia hypothesis and the notion of the Earth as a superorganism, the concept of superintelligence embodied in the internet, the idea of the singularity, all really were subtended by this big idea of the noosphere. That same year, Alice Paul presented to the US Congress, and this was her life work, the Equal Rights Amendment, which this is the centenary, 100 years later, it still has not passed. 35 states have ratified it, but it needs 38 states. And women raise 2.2% of funding, where men raise 97.8% of funding. But this is not just about women and men. This is about all voices needing to be heard and all hands need to be on deck to address the great problems that we face. In 1936, H.G. Wells, after an illustrious career writing science fiction, put forward his idea of a world encyclopedia, anticipating both the internet and Wikipedia. 1949, George Orwell in 1984. And fiction is often as good a vehicle for communicating these powerful ideas as science or sociology. His main character is working in the office of the Ministry of Truth, revising historical records to make the past conform to what the government wants people to believe. And he has the insight that who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. 1958, John von Neumann died that year, and shortly before his death, he confided to his close friend, mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, the first articulation of the concept of the singularity as such. The ever-accelerating progress of technology and changes in the mode of human life give the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race, beyond which human affairs, as we know them, cannot continue. This was 1958. 1961, Buckminster Fuller with the concept of world game, which really anticipated and required the internet. When I talk about collaborative intelligence, I typically use Wikipedia and world game as examples and draw on ideas from the singularity and the noosphere. Wikipedia started as a much more conventional idea. Nupedia was to be an encyclopedia produced by the experts and funded by advertising, but it wasn't going very well. So they tried this crowdsourcing experiment, and Wikipedia, within 11 months, letting ordinary people write articles was so much more effective that Nupedia shut down. When I did quite a bit of study about 10 years ago of Wikipedia and was absolutely fascinated at the size of the community of researchers using Wikipedia as a case study, because it is fascinating. It's not without bias, but it has less bias. World Game, and this is probably a photograph from the 1970s of Buckminster Fuller standing on a 75-foot Dymaxion map of the world. This was his concept of a way to unwrap the globe with minimal distortion of the sizes of countries. And so typically World Game was a day-long event in a university gymnasium where several hundred university students would come, but then at the end of the day, they'd roll up the map and turn off the lights and it was all over, right? So what we really need is a persistent environment, which we now have with the internet, the cloud, interactive maps, media, AI, and deep learning, and the potential to bring into that environment stories, games, projects, scorecards for impact tracking, and to identify through that process model projects that should be shared, adapted. So then we might live up to Buckminster Fuller's wise advice that you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. 1968, the big idea of Garrett Hardin's lifetime, the tragedy of the commons, easily visualized when you imagine successful capitalistic fishermen fishing for bluefin tuna and competing with each other and catching more and more bluefin tuna. And in fact, bluefin tuna are now at risk of extinction. But this big idea needs also to be translated to how we look at the internet going forward. Because increasingly, this great resource, this commons, is being privatized, paywalled, subject to surveillance, and turned into an eyeball-grabbing marketing kind of tool, very much reducing what it could be. 1972, we've spoken of James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis. 1983 and 1993, Vernor Vinge is a mathematician and also a science fiction writer. And he wrote 2 papers on the singularity. And the great one for which he's really known is his NASA paper of 1993. And I looked up Vernor Vinge and went and met with him because I wanted to know if he thought he had been misrepresented by Ray Kurzweil. And indeed he did, because Ray Kurzweil, again, a little bit like Herbert Spencer, was a branding agent who picked up only the most shocking of Vernor Vinge's 4 concepts of the singularity, so that everybody knows that the singularity is the moment when computers exceed human intelligence. But Vernor Vinge had 4 concepts. And this is a direct quote from his NASA paper. So the first was what Ray Kurzweil picked up, but the second and third are the vehicles for realizing the noosphere and collaborative intelligence. Large computer networks and their associated users may wake up as a superhumanly intelligent entity. Computer-human interfaces may become so intimate that users may reasonably be considered superhumanly intelligent. In other words, the humans are intimately involved with the technology at every step of the way. 1990 to present, Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web, and he is still actively engaged with the Web Foundation, trying to make this a public access resource. 1998 to present, talked about Jimmy Wales. So we get to the new millennium. These are not new trends, but they were able to ramp up exponentially because of the internet, centralizing control, concentrating wealth, and monetizing ideas. And so we had all these amazing visions, somewhat restricted in the potential for action. And I want to just give a few examples of what brought this about. 1980s, the news media, which had seen themselves as a public service, gradually shifted to become profit centers. And the Harvard Nieman Center has a very good report on how that process occurred. There were some big acquisitions, for example, of CBS, that started this process. 1994, Amazon is founded. 1998, Google is founded. 2004, Facebook is founded. And let's stop right there and skip 16 years to 2020, the COVID pandemic. And now the news media are all profit centers. And so the more horrific and scary and eye-catching to sell advertising, they can make that media. And we're all isolated, glued to our media devices, right? But meanwhile, while we're all watching the media about this horrific disease, the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich occurred that has ever occurred in the history of humanity. And this did get covered by the major media, but it would be one story apiece instead of hundreds or thousands of stories about the disease. And so, for example, Time magazine wrote, top 1% of Americans have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90%, and that's made the US less secure. But that was one article in the midst of hundreds. Jim Cramer of CNBC wrote, the pandemic led to one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. BBC wrote, millions become millionaires during the COVID pandemic. And that was directly illustrating what Henry George had warned about. In other words, those who already owned property, the property increased in value and they became millionaires. Those who had never owned property were much worse off. 2022 to the present, and I'm interested in what all of you think about this, but this broad-based public engagement with generative AI, I find absolutely fascinating. And the chips aren't in. This could go multiple directions, but AI is a bandwagon that we must start steering in a constructive direction. And all activities need resources. Well, there's a projected 15.7 trillion market in AI by 2030. That ought to be directed toward some of the problems that we need to solve. GAIL is working at a very small scale right now, but the focus is on collaborative intelligence and ultimately building a sandbox where we can try some small scale experiments with impact tracking, sort of mini world game concepts with specific models. So I just want to review some of the core concepts that were implicit in what I've said as a way to conclude. First, consensus building, obviously great in its place, but I suggest that it is vastly overused as a problem-solving tool and actually not constructive most of the time. And amazing professor at UC Berkeley, who did a lot of work on this, Irving Janis, and about the problems of bad decisions as a result of consensus-seeking processes. Crowdsourcing, idea that's been around for a while, but the term was actually coined in 2006 when Jeffrey Howe wrote an essay for Wired magazine where he talked about Amazon's acquisition of Mechanical Turk. And that's one example where there's a central requester who broadcasts a request to a large crowd of anonymous microtask performers. And they typically paid pennies to do things that take them seconds, right? And so they throw their microtask results into the hopper. The central requester processes these and, gets the result. Collective intelligence is similar. In other words, again, there's a central controller, this time a questioner, who broadcasts a question to a large crowd, again, of anonymous responders. They throw their responses into the hopper. They are processed by the central controller to generate, and at the end of both of these, you have essentially a consensus result. And the idea with collective intelligence is that that result is a better than average result as a result of the crowd participation. So these are both interesting ideas, but they have in common that there's a clear start time when the central controller broadcasts the request or the question. There's a clear end time when the central controller processes the deliverables, and the entire crowd is anonymous. I'm interested, in contrast, in the idea of collaborative intelligence, where the crowd is not anonymous. We are all unique players in the ecosystem of problem solving. We have unique talents, unique motivations, unique things that we can contribute and that we want to take away from that process. And so key to that is this concept of collaborative autonomy, which means you're not waiting for a consensus, okay, now go, right? Everybody starts doing whatever they're doing. And so the challenge is to create the kind of world game platform that can enable that. But that platform would then have the attribute of a constant iterative feedback loop, connecting human and AI agents, co-evolving collaborative intelligence. And what that ultimately means is that it's a gradual improvement process. We're here at the 2023 centenary of the noosphere with hearing about all these visions and ideas and hoping that this exchange leads to action and hoping that the action leads to impact that reflects this big idea of the noosphere. And hoping that we are also enabling a transformation from chaotic complexity to a more ordered complexity. So thank you.